Hi, Louise.
Hi, Lucy. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm all right, thanks.
Um, you're on here for the seminar, right?
Yes.
Can you see me?
Yes, I
Ah,
can.
let me pause my recording. This is silly. Um, yeah, I think some the others are likely to join us. We
Yeah.
begin. So, thank you to everyone, and I'd like to welcome you to um, today's seminar. So we're coming back into our series after a short break over the vacation period. So welcome to everyone and thank you for joining us. And so today's presenter, as you might already know, is Dr. Prah. And the title of today's seminar is titled Legacies of Enslavement in the Cape, Schematas of Black Life in the Archive. And just a bit about our presenter today. Dr. Efua Prah's research reflects her interest in theorizations in African critical thought, African migration studies, adolescent and childhood studies, and maternal and reproductive health. She currently works at the University of Stellenbosch in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. She has had over 20 years experience in various capacities as social justice activist, a lecturer, and health systems research consultant, among other key roles, which have all allowed her to strengthen her critical thinking and application skills, successfully engaging with various audiences, both large and small. Her publication record covers a broad spectrum of social and public health issues, from the study of children and childhoods, migratory sociopolitics, health systems research, to a critical race theory and gender dynamics. She's also the co-founder and owner of Blue Footprint Productions, a film company based in Cape Town, where she works as a videographer and making documentary films. So thank you so much, Dr. Prah, for gracing us with your presence, and I'm excited to hear your talk today. So just a reminder to all of our participants, just remember to keep yourself muted, and you're welcome to enter any questions or comments in the chats during the presentation, but we will have time allocated towards the end for question, answer, and further engagements. So I shall mute and hand over to you, Dr. Prah.
Thank you, Lucy, for the introduction and also for the invitation to present today. I always find these kinds of platforms really useful in sharing some very rudimentary ideas. It's almost like a fantastic soundboard that we can get going and generate a conversation around some of either our connecting points in all of our research, or indeed to critique what is presented here. Perhaps there's some gaps or things that I've understood from the record. So as Lucy has said, and as it's indicated on the poster, the title of today's presentation, and I want to add a little bit of a preamble there, that it is a very tentative work in progress kind of a title. And it's called Legacies of Enslavement in the Cape, Schematas of Black Life in the Archive. So just also want to indicate that the idea of a schemata is borrowed a little bit from psychology, and it represents kinds of these units of understanding, these snapshots, if you will, that lead us down a road where we are able to visualize and also gain a better understanding of the landscapes, the social and political, cultural, economic landscapes in which we live in. So somewhere in this presentation, I will be presenting my current research, which I'm super excited about. But let us begin. So the contribution this body of work presents is an exploration into variations of schematas of Black life. In a sense, I'm presenting snapshots of dark matter within which worlds of politico-cultural representations of difference lay bare the ugly truth that all is in fact not normal and none of it is actually acceptable. So the much discussed context of structural constraints of the way in which we experience life are often saddled or described within post-structuralist debates, and they seem somehow to dilute the density of systemic and historically legitimized violence against purported difference. So in a sense, we kind of have a very liberal taking where we tend to wash over the record with the socioeconomic realities, the overdetermining structures that push us into these that foreclose our experiences. And whilst of course this is true, I think that it's only part of the picture. It certainly can't describe the whole picture. So in previous months, I've been presenting and thinking critically around presentations of whiteness and choosing quite specifically to center white supremacist ideology as the counterpoint of structural violence. And it's been a useful exercise in mapping terrains of opacity, which I'll come back to later in the presentation, and terrains of pushback, terrains of resistance to sociocultural and political methodologies that would have me render my own body, in one instance, as an object to be pathologized, and that's my own body as a Black person, to be pathologized, scrutinized, and categorized, and in another cast aside and made obsolete. So I'm constantly straddling this occupational hazard of being both rendered visible and invisible, and both I experience actually as a violence. So as a medical anthropologist, my scope of interest lies in researching issues that undergird the structures of development in Africa more broadly, whilst engaging directly with questions of health and well-being on the continent. Health in this framing is understood as a resulting feature of the interlocking developmental trajectories that link our past to our presence. And thinking through arising debates in health and development helps us begin to imagine a transdisciplinary map of ideas that becomes essential in designing emerging health futures in Africa. So what I offer here today is an approach to the archive that searches for links that will then enable us to understand health as a complex compilation of interlocked systems that are both personally and publicly lived through, and also enjoy a long and protracted history that is horrifically cast. So the work here is I'm also trained a very long time ago as a historian, so I've always had a relationship with history and how in order for us to better understand our present circumstances, we also need to necessarily look back on our history and look at how we were figured as a society, how we have come to be where we are today. And so this complex compilation is what I'm referring to. And both the work of Frantz Fanon and Charles Mills has been instrumental in placing the needle, for me personally in my own research, has been instrumental in placing the needle in the right direction. So in Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon reminds us that, and I quote, "Beneath the body schema, I had created a historical racial schema. The data I used were provided not by remnants of feelings and notions of the tactile, vestibular, kinesthetic, or visual nature, but by the other, the white man, who had woven me out of 1,000 details, anecdotes, and stories." Later, he mentions how the other, the white man, had no scruples about imprisoning me. And this imprisoned identity is immediately and always under threat. It is at once captured, figured, and tortured. Necessarily, violence is the language of this encounter, this European encounter that we talk about in post-colonial studies, that we talk about when we are thinking through a decolonial lens. We often in subaltern circles talk about this European encounter. So under no circumstances must we forget this fact, that this encounter is primarily an encounter of violence. And we mustn't forget this fact because the haunting of this violence remains. Indeed, for South Africa, the boorishness of white settler ideology that wrought havoc on Black life, and more specifically on Black bodies, has remained. So here, let me quickly recount or briefly recount South Africa's health profile, citing some stats on infant mortality and maternal health as exemplary of the fissures that occur, and also how, unfortunately, Black life or death becomes a number to be logged. And I'll circle back to this flitting swipe I make against positivism. And so here we are, the South African health profile. So South Africa's health profile is pockmarked with what I call stark social inequalities or inequities, which translate into a high occurrence of premature mortality and a marked increase in health inequities across its regions or provinces. For example, estimates for infant mortality rates from the 2011 census in the predominantly rural Eastern Cape province is captured as 40.3 births per 1,000 deaths per 1,000 live births. So that's double that of the Western Cape, where we have 20.4 per 1,000 live births. So furthermore, there are also significant differences within provinces. For example, it is recorded that in facilities, that maternal mortality ratio is 56 per 100,000 live births in urban Cape Town, and 371 deaths per 100 live births in the rural district of the Central Karoo in the same province. So these differences are nothing short of disastrous and signal a festering cavity in what ought to be a uniformed experience of healthcare. Thus, over 2 decades ago, South Africa's policymakers hedged their bets on the adoption of a primary healthcare approach, which, if we're looking at the history of South Africa's healthcare system, had been kind of recommended. The Beveridge Plan was recommended in the early, around the 1940s, the closure of the World War II. But it wasn't taken up when the Nationalist Party came into power. And so when the changeover of governance in 1994 happens, policymakers hedged their bets on adopting this primary healthcare approach. And the 1997 white paper for the transformation of the health system in South Africa set out to level the outcomes field in terms of access to quality health care. Central to this commitment to primary health care was a focus on the social determinants of health, which, as a matter of due diligence, was ratified in the Health Act 61 of 2003. And whilst, of course, these mechanisms or these pathways to establishing a much more robust and service user-friendly healthcare approach were necessary, it unfortunately falls short of what I think is the rot at the center of how we organize ourselves in society. These are some of the liberal acts of saving our ailing healthcare system. And I'm cynical only because I think that much more can be learned. I don't think it's just a matter of attending to social determinants. The rot lays not only in a disfigured and unequal current healthcare system, but rather in an age-old replication of what Charles Mills in his 1997 book calls the racial contract. So the titling of his book, The Racial Contract, is useful because it subverts the idea of the social contract. And you will remember that the social contract is this idea of social organizing that is heralded by the floating European scholastic giants, the social scientists, the positivists, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, that call for, in their basic analysis, they call for the utility of accepting the state as the moral agent in determining the right course of action in terms of governance and social organizing. So the relationship between the state and the individual is mutually beneficial to maintain law and order. This is the premise of the social contract. Services are rendered, and those that are primed to thrive do so. And those that are designed to fail do so exquisitely and are subsequently banished from civilized groupings. So this is Mill's departure point, and he deftly presents the malady at the heart of organized society. What Charles Mill says is that the social contract, in fact, is inherently racist. The social contract only really was conceived with the European white man as the starting point of organizing. And I centralize the white man there because Carol Pateman, which is Charles Mills, also works with this idea of the racial contract based on Carol Pateman's work, The Sexual Contract, which was a fantastic argument or remark against, in similar ways that Charles Mills took it, that the designing of the social contract was inherently gendered. So the social contract, Mill says, is, and I quote, "The peculiar contract to which I'm referring, though based on the social contract tradition that has been central to Western political theory, is not a contract between everybody, we the people, but just the people who count, the people who really are people, we the white people. So it is a racial contract," and I close quotations. So it must be stated here that Mills is not seeking to discount the validity of the idea of the social contract, but rather signals an important interrogation that the obfuscation of the ugly realities of group power and domination, if not supplemented with additional analysis and reading, becomes a profoundly misleading account of the way the modern world actually is and has come to be. So in 1994, at the arrival of democratic rule, based on this idea that the way in which we organize society, if it is argued, if we can accept this idea, this provocative statement that Charles Mills puts forward, if we accept this provocation and we look at the arrival of democratic rule in 1994, I hope, we can have maybe a useful discussion at the end of this presentation about what that constitution looks like and about what democracy looks like and how it's played itself out in South Africa. In 1994, it's heralded as the hallmark of the demise of apartheid, where the tenets of the constitution are thought to have put in place the dismantling of systems of discrimination and, more importantly, a shattering of racist ideologies. So the intentions are there, the efforts are there. The efforts, while commendable in their aspirational quality to forge developmental trajectories along ideas of non-racialism, were not adequate in leveling the socio-cultural landscape of recourse to a healthy life. The pursuit of vitality remains locked into oppressive systems that continually demote Black life and reward those in close proximation to white supremacist ideologues. So what is argued is that the mechanisms of racial discrimination are imbricated or braided into systems of inequality. And indeed, as Ndumiso Dladla outlines, and I quote here, this has in actual historical terms not only meant the installation and development of white supremacy as an ordering principle within the political sphere, it has also seen its realm of influence extended over all human experience in South Africa, and I close quotes. So what Dladla pursues in his work, in much of his work, is a needed focus on the systemic applications of racism and its proximity to white settler ideology in South Africa. And the two together, until we're having a meaningful conversation about race, about the placing of race, not also just in attending to these considered flare-ups that we have within our society. But if we can honestly and sort of plain-facedly say that, yes, of course, society is built around very dangerous and problematic racial lines, and we can probably enter into a more productive act of dismantling or decolonizing or de-imperializing our states of being. So the idea of systemic applications becomes ever more relevant when we cast our understanding of the world as composing itself around an intricate web of connectivity. So we are in essence a hive of possible mergers, divergences, and complex interactions. And these complex interactions themselves are made up of a myriad layers of meaning that as a society we co-create, we reimagine, and we reinstate over and over again through the ages. And so it is this relationality that I'm interested in, is how are we basically enactments wherein the bodies of earlier historical recordings of ourselves, that we are essentially sort of these mirror images of how society was organized when society was organized. You know, those early settlement, when settlement happens in the Cape, what life was like then is what life is like now. The inequalities that we experienced then, although not systematically in place, we don't have enslavement anymore. We don't have colonialism anymore. We don't have apartheid anymore. But yet we are living with the vestiges, the legacies. Why is it that when I walk into a shop, I can be racially profiled? Or indeed in the film that you watched, and I'll remark upon it a bit later, that she experiences, the young woman who is the central focus in that documentary film, why is it that she experienced health in that way? It's not only because of her socioeconomic position. So from time to time, I think about this dynamic between you know, the critical players in enslavement and colonialism. So the European other and the African. I'm always left wondering if those enjoying the spoils of this violence, who are living in close approximation to this opulence, have any idea where their sense of freedom, comfortability, and vitality stem in part from. And so often, you know, there is a tendency for, so you may want to charge me with what, for example, Achille Mbembe, Cameroonian scholar Achille Mbembe has regarded as a victim complex of Blackness, or recreating essentialist notions of being, which is part of the postmodern liberal canon, would have me labeled as, or better still, for playing the race card, or for having a chip on my shoulder, which is a remark that one of the listeners on the radio had said about when I shared on radio about being racially profiled in a health and well-being shop here in Cape Town. And part of the story is, no, I'm not being a victim. And no, I do not ascribe to essentialized notions of race. But yes, I do have a chip on my shoulder. And this is, I think it's healthy. This affective turn is a normal and healthy response to a history of violence that extends into current time, where absences and closures, if I'm going to borrow from Gayatri Spivak talking about epistemic violences, absences and closures appear. And so in earlier discussions, I have been grappling with this idea of whiteness, and I'm sort of also playing with this idea of Black life and Blackness. And the scholarship on whiteness is so extensive. So in the interest of time here, I'm going to call upon the work of Eileen Moreton Robinson. And she's fantastic. And if anybody wants to read some of her work, she's a great starting point or continuing point. Robinson, she's an Australian academic, Indigenous feminist, author, and activist for Indigenous rights. And included in her extensive archive of Australian critical race scholarship is her attention to the study of whiteness. And she contends that part of the imaginarium of the white politic is the preoccupation with the possession of land, of bodies, and of knowledge via the terra nullius logos. And she articulates this idea of the white possessive, which is also the title of her 2015 seminal text, The White Possessive, Property, Power, and Indigenous Sovereignty. Her work uses a Foucauldian logic. And there she argues that the white possession, and I quote here, as a mode of rationality functions within disciplinary knowledges and regulatory mechanisms, defining and circumscribing other people's sovereignty in particular ways. So you can hear the Foucauldian messaging in what she says, close quotations. Elsewhere in her work, she cites Foucault's conceptual work, Society Must Be Defended. And she threads ideas of race, sovereignty, and war into how systems of subjugation and violence are part and parcel of a politics of possession. And this is an important cog in my thinking, which also pulls focus to another scholar from South America who's helped me a lot. And it's this idea put forward. Her name is Rosa Amelia Plumel Uribe. And Plumel Uribe, in her text, her title of her book is, and I think it's publicly accessible. It's titled White Ferocity, the Genocides of Non-Whites and Non-Aryans from 1492 to date, in which she describes, in what she describes as, and I quote here, the banishment of Blacks from the human family, close quotations. She says, during the 3.5 centuries of mass, 3.5, and I'll reiterate that again, 3.5 centuries, every day, every week, every month, every year, for 3.5 centuries of mass deportation and enslavement of Africans, one conspicuous feature stood out from the start, then developed and gradually became an element of culture. This was the eviction, the banishment of Blacks from the human family, for which the white race became the gold standard on a planetary scale. To evict a group from the human family is to annihilate it. When a group is banished, the victims are seen as belonging to a different species, and the process of annihilating them can proceed in a climate of almost utter indifference, close quotations. And Plumel Uribe's work here, I think, I sort of had a settled, I felt like the dust was settling when I came across her book via also Samir Amin, who is also a fantastic economist, African economist to read. And it's sort of ignites this, the conversation in my project, which is looking at, it started out wanting to look at previously enslaved populations and their experience of birthing. So I decided to go to the archives to try and account for how previously enslaved women in the Cape experienced their maternal journeys, their reproductive journeys. Instead, what I came across in the archive was something else, which I love about research, is that you go in with one idea and then you're often surprised by what the data is revealing to you. So now I'm going to provide the snapshot of Black life in the Cape, and we can have a conversation whether or not it's clear to see how a figuration, this banishment of Blacks from the human family, this racial contract, that the way in which we organize society really is inherently racist, and that until we attend to those racist ideologues, those initial racist ideologues, we're kind of just going to be in the cyclical pattern of replicating replicating dangerous and problematic cycles. So first, there's a number of characters. I'm so excited about this research. There's a number of characters which is interesting, and I've jotted them down somewhere to remark if anybody wants to ask a question about it. So firstly, I went and I thought, okay, I'm going to attend to the birth and death records. They're a little bit, there's no narrative there that I can tease out. So instead, I thought, okay, there's a category in the records that talks about the Book of Complaints. And then I thought, this might be interesting to look at whatever is housed in the Book of Complaints, which itself is a moot point. Slavery, enslavement is an abomination. It is it's a crime against humanity. It's a violence. And to be logged as complaining about a crime against humanity is something else that we can unpack later. But within this Book of Complaints, there's a character named the Guardian of Slaves. And this, I haven't even come across it in any of the historical writings where we talk about the Guardian of Slaves. And the role of the Guardian of Slaves is not to protect, as you would think, protect the rights and the lives of enslaved people, but rather to act as the buffer between the lived experience of people and the legal system. So the guardian of slaves would listen to these complaints that enslaved people were making, and judge whether or not those merited being sort of escalated to the legal courts. So there's so many of them. If you can think about the history of slaves, it ended in 1834. The records start in about 1826, and there's so many of them. So I'm going to give you snapshots of what I found here, and I will, in the interest of time, probably just account for the children that appear here. So age, number application 18, age 14, birthplace, this colony, by whom or whose or on whose behalf made. So who's the complaint made, on whose behalf is it made? It's made, her name is Sylvia. As whose property registered? Stephanus Lombard. Subject of complaint or application date. Complained that she has been illegally punished by her master with a cane. She's 14. Snapshot number 2. Complained of having been severely flogged by his master with a horsewhip without any cause. 18. Complained that she had been severely beaten by her mistress without any cause. Age 3. Application was made by the aunt of this slave, who is a free woman named Saki, for the guardian's assistance to enable her to purchase her freedom. 15. Name Aurora. Application was made by the mother of the slave, a free woman named Carolina, for the interference of the guardian to enable her to purchase her freedom. Ramka, 12. Complained through her mother, a free woman named Rosie, of having been severely beaten and otherwise ill-treated by her master. Complainant 13, 11, and 13, Jonathan, Thomas, and Carolus, requested the guardian to inquire whether there were not some favorable conditions regarding them in the will of their late mistress, so that they may be free. And these are just some of the snapshots. There's so many of them, of people being illegally punished, being beaten. There are others that are about not wanting to be sold into the country, requesting the guardian's influence to prevent the master from selling her into the country, assaulted and struck in the face by her mistress without just cause. There's also a number of instances of sexual misconduct, of births that happen as a result of rapes that are here, which I won't read. So I showcase these snapshots unadorned from analysis, primarily as I'm still grappling with what it all means, and then also because I would like to invite the listener to make up their own minds about what they think. What does it mean to listen to this? And the number of complaints that the guardian heard, within a day were hundreds. It was just every day there was something. And there's the day book. So you lodge the complaint and then you have the proceedings that happen. And I would love it to discuss this, especially discuss within a larger critique supported by Africanist arguments that position the problem of unfreedom as symptomatic of a bilious state that is created to sustain racist, neoliberal, capitalist orientations at the peril of Black life. So it's been well documented and discussed that enslavement was part of capitalist accumulation, but it's done so at the peril of Black life. And this is part of the argument, or part of the line of work that I'm trying to generate here, is that Black life, as it's figured in the archive, is one of violence. It's one of oppression and exploitation. And I am particularly mindful not to curate an exhibition of Black life as Black pain. And Yasmin Ibrahim has been helpful here. So Ibrahim has written this fantastic article just recently, 2021, called The Dying Black Body in Repeat Mode, the Black Horrific on a Loop. And in this article, she tackles this idea head on, this idea of talking about Black life as Black pain, and it's tied also to the work of Saidiya Hartman, but it's how do we speak about these realities without reenacting the violences? So in speaking of the reality of Black death as a recurrent, banal encounter, so essentially the more you hear it, the more it just becomes like strange fruit hanging from the tree. That poem that was written about Black life, the experience of American slaves who were lynched. The paper proceeds by exploring the historical resonance of the Black horrific through time as a banal encounter. So we get this kind of Black pain gets normalized. The death of Blackness of Black people becomes normalized. It has a resonance in talking about Black visuality through Frank Wilderson's Afro-pessimism. And Afro-pessimism locates anti-Blackness through everyday scenes rather than isolating it to these instances of spectacular violence, which I think is also part of the work of Agamben. But I'm still also working through that. So I think also here there might be a useful discussion moment to talk about Glissant, Edward Glissant's work, the Martinician activist, poet, academic scholar. And he writes in his book, The Poetics of Relation, he writes about this concept opacity, which I love, love, love. And Glissant remarks on this idea of opacity as a pushback, as a writing against the demand for the transparency of Black life. It's a pushback against the insistence of testimony, really. And the right of opacity becomes the right not to be understood, or it becomes the right to be understood on one's own terms. That when you're writing about Black life, you have to have this linguistical approach, this poetic of language that attends to the problem of not wanting to reenact those violences. How do we not reduce these instances, these snapshots of Black life as epistemic violences? In order for us to comprehend Black life, do we have to keep talking about how horrific it was, the Black horrific? So when I am thinking about the Black horrific, or the figuration of Black life as something that has become so banal, that we're so used to seeing Black death, that it becomes so normalized that when that young woman walks into the doctor's office, she's not only read as somebody who might be unemployed, so she's in a different socioeconomic bracket that somehow affords her, makes her prime fodder for exploitation, which in and of itself is so problematic. But that also she's understood as this complex compilation of all the histories of Black life. And that when we understand that the subconscious bias that constantly plays itself, until we acknowledge that and until we start writing it into the record, we will continue to replicate these inequities. And it reminds me this idea of opacity, and I don't know how to hold all of those tangents together. And I think this is what is so remarkable about the experience of this complexity. I remember talking to my grandmother about her life just before she had passed on, about 3 years before she passed on. I wanted to sort of archive and talk about her life, but I tried as much as I could to get her to talk about, she was born in 1917. But she really was the embodiment of what Glissant talks about, this opacity. She rendered her life completely opaque. So I asked her, what was it like? And it took her 7 minutes to talk about 90 93 years of her life. 7 minutes flat, she was done. And no amount of provocation, prodding in my, my young, curious mind that I had gave me much. So she didn't talk about the Group Areas Act of 1950s. She didn't talk about, and she moved from the Eastern Cape to Cape Town. She didn't talk about in the 1948 Nationalist Party coming to power, the dismantling of colonial rule. She didn't talk about World War I, World War II, nothing. There was not and she didn't talk about my uncle being held, incarcerated in Robben Island. None of that came. And so this silence for me is quite something. It's quite telling of part of the story of Black life. It was her resistance, the pushback against the narrative of Black pain. So by troubling these inherited colonial geographies, we can recast critical players and lived sites of our shared history. And this is part of why the archive is porous. It's transmutable, and it can be translated in its multiplicity. And so in closing, I want to end off with some snapshots. Oh, I think they've dropped off. There's some snapshots from one of the articles that I've been reading around public health and the syphilis epidemic. Let's see if I can find it here. Yeah. So, and this is part of the snapshotting of how our public healthcare system has been designed. So you would have here that the department in January, hold on, sorry, pardon me. It's a fantastic article, and just for your records, it's titled "Public Health in the Era of South Africa's Syphilis Epidemic of the 1930s and 1940s." It's written by someone called Alan Jeeves, and in it, it's this careful accounting of the sort of the nexus between white fragility and Black bodies and Blackness as diseased, as pathologized, and the need for population control along health lines. And it's also this creation of Black life and Black bodies, not only as seen as a labor force. So the only utility and the only reason that you attend to the public health of your population is because they're going to be a labor force. So the labor supply was the dangers posed to white communities that the syphilis epidemic had, and this high risk, so-called the role of poverty and high risk sexual behavior were part of the discussions of the 30s and 40s, which of course you see replicating itself. And then, when HIV and AIDS was discussed as a public health concern in the 80s and 90s, the same kinds of languages were used. So where's that linguistic record? Where is the source point of that linguistic record? And this is part of what I want us to discuss further, and why these legacies of enslavement in the Cape. If we look at the schematas of Black life in the archive, we begin to start mapping how and why these inequities are so hard to shake. So thanks very much. I think that takes me up to my time. And I look forward to discussing this further with you.
Wow, thank you so much for such an engaging and widely interesting presentation. I don't know, can I see just by a show of hands if anyone has questions or, something to contribute? But maybe as people are gearing up, oh, I see a hand there. As people are gearing up, I'm just struck by, you said, you made a point about how there's a tendency to dilute the density of violence. And you went about, tracing that or unearthing this density through this transdisciplinary approach that you are articulating. I'm interested to know how, because you also mentioned how you are critiquing this tendency of the health system to just log this positivist tendency to log stats, and reduce this violence. So I'm interested to hear more about that. I kept on coming back to that idea as you were giving us a snapshot of the complaints. Just how dense that reality was. But maybe let me stop there. I'm just interested to hear more about that.
So I'll start with the one about logging Black bodies. I teach in my course in medical anthropology, I talk about taxonomies of difference and talk about the colonial project to categorize and to log indigenous sort of savage communities, and that part of the understanding of the savage or the native was to create an index of bodies, an index of the subaltern, the othered person. So in our social scientific record, we have the exotification of Black bodies based on anthropometry, the size of their skulls, and anatomical structures. And it's that kind of that's my problem with the logging and the counting of Black life. Black life and Black bodies, is this tendency for us to reify the presentation of Black bodies in space. And it's that reification that I'm cautious about. Furthermore, in early counting of Black bodies, it was used, the way in which we used the statistical record of Black bodies was in terms of its utility, or its Black people as a utility, as a commodity, as Black labor. And that's when we were counted. We were counted when we were fodder. We were counted when we were a product. And we were counted when it was about the removal of our bodies from particular spaces. And so it's this history of being counted that renders the hysterical record dangerous. And so I'm very cautious about counting the numbers, although it's useful. See, and this is part of the trickery, is that it's useful in making an argument that mortality rates for Black women are much higher comparatively, also, across regions. There's so much of a difference, and that also has a lot to do with the organizing of apartheid funding across provinces. So there was a nurturing of a particular culture of segregatory life and social welfare that discouraged proper reform in the building of South Africa's public healthcare sector. And it's that kind of the taxonomizing that I've got issues with. And then to remark upon this idea of the density of dark matter, it's a turn of phrase that I use, and it's because I don't want to yet say that I'm overwhelmed by the record there. It's just that there's so much. When you are in the archive and you've got this book and the complaints are it's just phenomenal. It's to even describe it as heartbreaking wouldn't even cut it, because I think, I feel that would be doing it an injustice just to say that it's heartbreaking. But to imagine that this is life as it was experienced by so many people. And there's also what is interesting, I've managed, and hopefully, in the book that I will later write about all of this, there's an interesting story that is emerging that I found in the archive about a young woman who was taken from Mozambique. And it's, that's that density that I talk of, is that it's quite heavy. It is so much, like there's just literally pages and pages of Black life. And it's actually quite something. It's quite something to look at in 2022, and still hold all of the inequities of 2022 and hold the inequities of enslavement. So I have a very direct and personal relationship with the young woman in the documentary film. I don't know how many of you got a chance to see it. And it's in some ways, for her to be living through things that are so surmountable. It's such a quick fix. What she experienced is such a quick fix. And yet so much trauma based on reading her as a castaway, as a Black horrific, just a number to be counted. It doesn't matter. Her life is actually, relatively useless to the record. She's not working, and so why do we need to save this Black body? And even in the afterlife of her young infant, that the records of her young infant, her body gets lost. I mean, what is that? That's just unacceptable. So it's this density that I speak of. Yeah.
Yeah.